Welcome to Section 9, Identifying Value-Creating Strategies. You know, as you become a value-added advisor, there is no tool that will be more important to you than being able to have strategic conversations with your clients. It uncovers a world of opportunities to identify ways to optimize the business, to uncover and manage risks of the business, and to add to the relationship that you have, and therefore to get more business for the bank. So it may sound that strategy formulation is a God-given talent, but actually it's far from that. What we're going to show is there's a systematic framework. Simply ask a range of questions and do the work, or work with your clients to do the work to find the answers, and you can come up with good ideas for a business going forward. So our objectives for this section are just that. We're going to review a systematic framework for identifying and evaluating synergies. We're going to apply that framework to a fictitious company called Gleason Brewing, Inc. It's a fictitious craft brewing company, so we get to talk about beer. And then we're going to show how shareholder value is actually a critical part of the strategy formulation process. So we're moving on to question 4, which is which operating and investing strategies would enhance competitive position and create value. So there's basically 5 questions that you need to answer to come up with a good strategy. Question 1, what industry segment is the client business in? Question 2, is the industry segment creating value? Question 3, how does the client industry compare to its peers on the factors that matter most? 4, what strategies might enhance that competitive advantage? And then 5, which of those strategies creates the most value? If you walk through this question by question and then do the analyses that's necessary to answer those questions, you will end up with a value-creating strategy. That's how this works. So let us illustrate all of this, again, for Gleason Breweries, Inc. So Gleason was founded by a man named Brian Gleason in 1984 as a premium craft brewer in Denver, Colorado. It's a mid-sized craft brewer, and it's shipped over 50,000 barrels each year. The company is owned by Brian and his wife, Michelle. Together they own 51% of the company. They have 2 children, Sarah and William, that both have 24.5% of the company. Brian's been the chairman of the company since it was founded in 1983. Michelle has been the brewmeister for the company and actually has a background traveling the world to understand brewing and how to do it best. And she's been in charge of brewing and operations since its inception. Sarah is the head of marketing. And unfortunately, William suffered a serious injury when he was in college and is now unable to work and is in need of ongoing care, and that actually is placing some burden on the family financially. So that's kind of the family background. Their primary issues on the strategic side is, how are they going to grow from here? There's a bunch of options for that we want to discuss. Should they use aluminum cans? For those of you who may not know, aluminum cans actually protect the taste of the beer better. And they can be more efficient, but they only work at higher volumes. They become more cost-effective that way. At low volumes, they really don't make sense. Also, a big strategic issue for them is, should they affiliate with one of the large, as they call them, Goliath brewers? So think of Anheuser-Busch or Molson Coors as a Goliath brewer. Many of the craft brewers are finding that allying with those companies helps them to grow. On the financial side, should they be issuing more debt? Or, would that give them more tax savings if they did that? Those sorts of things. And then on the owner side, does it make sense to monetize part or all of their business? Or also, should they somehow diversify their family's wealth? We're going to answer all of these questions with respect to Gleason Breweries. Their banking history, they have a long-term relationship with the bank. There's a $1.2 million credit facility in place that was issued in 2004, and it's due in 2024. So that's just some background information on Gleason Breweries. So question number 1 is the segmentation question. And the basic idea is you have to make sure you're clear, who are you competing against? And it's really important you define that group appropriately, because if you miss out on companies that you're truly competing against, when you get to the further questions around, well, what's your competitive position, you're defining that position vis-a-vis some group of competitors. So you've got to make sure you use that right group. So the core question is, which companies are the ones you compete against? And it's really important to get this right. It also often helps to take the customer's perspective. If the customer didn't buy their craft brew from Gleason's, who else would they buy it from? And industries can be segmented by a whole range of different factors, whether it's customers, product, cost structure, capital intensity, distribution channels, or geography. And segments are different if they meet the following criteria. 1, do you see healthy, standalone competitors in each segment? If so, chances are pretty good they're separate segments. Second criteria is, can a competitor in both areas exit one without harming the other? Again, if the answer to that is yes, you're probably dealing with 2 separate segments rather than just one. So as we apply this again to Gleason, it's pretty clear when you look at the beer market that there's a small number of Goliaths that have a huge proportion of the overall volume. And then there's a whole range of craft brewers that are much smaller. So the Goliaths produce 87% of the barrels, but interestingly, their growth is negative, minus 1.2%. And there's more than 1 million barrels produced within that Goliath category per company. There's heavy spending on advertising, and they exert strong control over their distribution. Craft brewers, as we're going to see, are really quite different segment. They produce only 13% of the barrels. There's a much higher growth rate though, 5% growth versus minus 1.2, again indicating we've probably got separate segments here. And they're also independent, with less than 25% of them being owned by one of the Goliaths. And they're also traditional, with the majority of the volume in beers whose flavors derive from the traditional or innovative new brewing ingredients for their fermentation. So these are kind of the definitions of Goliaths versus craft brewers. And again, very, very clearly, take a look at this graph. I think that makes the case. You've got 2 different segments here. And interestingly, Gleason is kind of toward the middle, maybe a little on the upper side of the craft brewing segment. You can also look at it in terms of pricing. The Goliath's pricing, in this case per 12-pack in bottles, is significantly lower than the craft brewing average of almost $15 per 12-pack. Interestingly, there's another segment here, which is the regional macro breweries. When you look at Milwaukee's Best or Pabst Blue Ribbon, looks like that might be another segment as well. But again, we want to focus here on the craft brewing segment. Again, the pricing being another indication that they are a separate segment. On this next page, we can also see that regional and microbreweries account for over 90% of the craft brewing segment, and they've seen the fastest growth. So again, pretty clearly, we've got a separate segment here in craft brewing. Having resolved that craft brewing is itself a separate segment, let's now focus on the second question, which is the industry segment creating value? And what we want to do here is answer that question by using a range of analyses. First, we can look to stock prices to see whether the stock prices are going up or down. That's a clear answer as to whether the industry is doing well or not. You can also look at a pattern of economic profits to see if those are positive or negative, and again answer the question as to whether value is being created. You can also look to industry entry or exit analysis, or just industry sales and profit analysis. If you see many companies entering the industry, that's an indication that things are doing pretty well in the industry and others are wanting to invest. Contrary, if you see ones leaving the industry, that's an indication that things aren't going so well. Again, trends in sales and profits, if you see those going up, good indications, down, negative. There's also, what we're going to show you is the Porter's 5 Forces analysis, which is a great way to quickly understand what's going on in an industry, and it'll also point to where things might be going in the future. So let me just catch you up on the slides and show you how these analyses are done. So again, the core question is the industry segment creating value? And there's no more direct way to answer that question for public companies than to look at their stock prices. That's what we've done on this chart, where, straight out of Yahoo Finance, what we've done is we've selected a range of public beer companies, and we've simply said, well, okay, over the past 5 years, what has happened to the stock prices of these companies? And what we see is quite dramatic. What it says is they have all underperformed the S&P 500 by quite some amount. This is a great analysis. One, it takes you almost no time to put together. Just go to Yahoo Finance, find the public companies, plot it out. And there's also never nothing to say about this. One, it focuses on the thing that matters most, which is value. But then it also tells some kind of a story. There is some reason why public beer companies have significantly underperformed the S&P 500. And in fact, many of them have actually destroyed value over a 5-year period. Raises a really interesting question, which would be great to talk to your clients about, which is, what's going on here? And why are some doing better than others? Now, importantly, we decided in our last segment that we were focusing on the craft brewing companies. And most of those are private, not public. So you can't observe public stock prices for those. I'll show you in a second. There's another analysis you can do in that situation. But as we start to answer this question as to, well, why has production or why has stock prices gone down so much, one fact that comes to light is that beer consumption per capita has actually been declining in the United States and in many other countries around the world for the last 20 years. What's happened basically, if you look at this chart, is that beer has been losing market share to spirits since 2001. So while beer is still the most popular drink, hard alcohol, spirits, has really taken significant market share away from beer. As we think about beer also, it's important to understand that men are the primary consumers of beer. That's most true for craft beer, and then a little bit less so for import and light beer. But again, men are the primary focus here of this industry and segment. And look at this. Not only do they have the largest consumption per capita, but unfortunately, that segment is not growing. It's virtually flat, has been and is predicted to be flat into the future. So we're starting to come up with some answers as to why the industry has underperformed the S&P 500. Well, number one, per capita consumption's gone way down, and the number of people in the market, the customer segment, is not growing. So it starts to become clear what's going on here. I suppose on the other side, it's true that the price of beer has grown while the volume has stagnated. So that helps a little bit. So now, for private companies, what do? Well, you can do the exact same analysis. Again, the question is this segment creating value? And what you can do is look at a range of private companies, and for those companies, you can observe net operating profit after tax. You can observe how much capital there is. You could look at NOPAT over K and take a perpetuity as a sense for what the capital equals. Or if you can use a public or private equity value, that can help as well. And then you multiply that by the cost of capital to get the amount that would have to be paid to shareholders period after period. You compare that to the NOPAT in each period and see, has there been a positive or negative economic profit? We've done that analysis now for the craft brewing segment. And first, we see for Gleason, the good news is that over the last 5 years, it's actually created significant economic profits, and it looks like it's doing even better. But that's not the case for all the competitors. Amber has been kind of right on the line of zero value creation. It's also important to look at Grizzly. Grizzly is a really interesting competitor, about the same size as Gleason, and they were struggling. But in 2014, they decided to ally with a Goliath brewer. And wow, look what that's done to their economic profit over 5 years. So again, we'll get to know these companies a little bit more as we do more analysis on them. But the basic idea here is I want to make sure you see that even for private companies, pretty easy to answer the question, is this segment creating value? Again, you can use an economic profits analysis to do that. So let's move on. The craft brewing segment, as we said, has taken significant market share away from both the premium and sub-premium sections. So that's good. That's why we're seeing, as I said before, the 5% growth in this segment versus the macro brewers. Many companies have entered, though, the craft brewing segment. So I mentioned another way to look at the industry is, what's the entry of new companies? And here we've seen dramatic entry, a 16.8% cumulative average growth rate in the number of U.S. breweries between 1983 and 2017. So just a huge explosion. And so that indicates that there is some value creation here, and many are jumping in, and perhaps, over time, it's going to make it more challenging. It also indicates that maybe it's pretty easy to enter this industry if so many are doing that. So let's hold on to that thought for just a little bit. We'll come back to that soon. So Michael Porter is a professor at Harvard in business, and he wrote seminal books on strategy, competitive advantage, and strategy. And one of his most famous contributions is simply this. It's called the Porter's 5 Forces Framework. And his key thought is, if you really want to understand what's going on in an industry, it's not enough to just look at the industry itself. You have to look at least 4 things outside of that industry segment. So you need to look at not just the competitor's rivalry within that industry, but you need to look at things like the bargaining power of buyers. So, for example, if there's only one or a very small number of key buyers of the products or services of the industry, they exert great force on that industry and can pull the value creation out of that industry and save it for themselves. So an example of that might be the U.S. government and the defense industry. The U.S. government buys the vast majority of all defense products worldwide. And so if the U.S. government suddenly decides, you know what, we're beating swords into plowshares, we're not going to do that anymore, that would be an enormous impact on the entire defense industry. So bargaining power of buyers is something that can impact the industry from outside. On the other side, you can think about the bargaining power of suppliers. The thinking there is if there's one or more suppliers that provides a key component of that industry, what they can do is they can say, well, hold it, let's charge higher and higher prices for this component and pull the value creation out of that industry and again save it for themselves. An example of that might be Intel. Intel has done a fantastic job over decades at saying, well, if you want the latest microprocessors in your computers, you've got to use Intel processors. And so we're going to charge more and more for those processors. And what they've done is pulled a lot of value out of the PC industry and saved it for themselves. So you need to look at, in addition to the industry, the bargaining power of buyers and suppliers. Then you also have to look at the threat of new entrants. How likely is it that new companies can come in? Well, if it's really easy, if there's no barriers to entry, you can assume that if it's a great industry, a lot of people will say, hey, they're getting wealthy, I want to be wealthy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to enter the industry. And as they do, you can bet that they're going to compete the returns of that industry eventually down to the cost of capital. So even if you've got a fantastic industry the way it is right now, if there's no good barrier to entry and it's really easy for others to do so, you can assume that they will. Then also, the fourth thing from outside the segment you need to consider is what about the threat of substitutes? So you can think of this as, what other ways can customers meet the needs that our products and services address? So within the beer market, as we've seen, there's potential substitution from hard alcohol. So those are the things you need to consider outside of the segment. Of course, within the segment, you have to consider what are the number of competitors. The more competitors there are, the hotter the competition. Also, you need to think about growth. If there's a lot of growth, typically there's less direct competition. If it's static or even decreasing, as you see in the macro brew industry right now, you better believe they're going to be fighting tooth and nail for every bit of market share. And also, you need to consider the degree of differentiation. Right? If what they're ultimately selling is a commodity, they're all competing on the same basis. Again, you can expect really, really tough competition. On the other hand, if there's a lot of differentiation in the strategies, They're less focused on each other and more focused on their own games. So that's kind of some broad views around how to use the 5 forces framework. I've never seen this fail. Again, our objective here is not so much to be brilliant, or certainly to attempt to be smarter than your clients. That's not it. You want to get into good conversations with them, and you want to offer good ideas. So this is a framework that I have never seen fail. If you spend 5 minutes, just 5 minutes, talking about this with your client, both you and I suspect your client will emerge with a much richer understanding of not only what's going on in the industry now, but what might be going on in the future. So let's see if that's true by applying it to the craft brewing segment. So let's start right at the top. Threat of new entrants. Well, heck, it's gone from very small to over 8,000, right, with that huge growth rate. So we've got to say that we've seen a lot of companies enter the industry. On the other hand, though, it's not just as easy as starting to brewing beer in your bathtub. One of the toughest parts of this industry is gaining distribution. And so we've kind of put a 0 on this one, which is what we mean as balanced. Plus means it's favorable for the industry. 0 means it's balanced, and negative means it's unfavorable for the industry segment. So with threat of new entrants, let's kind of put them in the middle somewhere. Let's proceed counterclockwise to bargaining power of suppliers. Here too, it's a bit balanced. Some of the inputs are largely commodities, but especially when you consider the craft brewing segment, there's very specific types of hops that they need to produce the specific flavors that they need to succeed. So a little bit balanced. There's a blend of inputs from commodities to very specialized ones. And of course, the more specialized the inputs, the more those suppliers can price higher and pull value creation out of the industry for themselves. So on the bargaining power suppliers, we've left that one as kind of neutral as well. Let's move over to the bargaining power of buyers. Well, this is downright favorable news. The likelihood that any one person is going to buy so much craft beer that they're going to impact the entire market is virtually nil. There's a very large number of buyers. They're unaffiliated. So that one is almost universally positive for this segment. Let's also think about threat of substitutes. And yes, as we've said, there is always a threat of substitution. And for especially the macro brews, we've seen how hard alcohol has actually pulled a significant portion of the market away from the macro brews. But that hasn't happened with the micro brews. On the counter side to that, you might say, craft brewing have been around forever, right? They've been around for, hundreds and hundreds of years. So as you look well into the future, do you think there's going to be a pretty healthy macro brew industry? I suspect that there is. So let's leave that one as favorable. Now let's look to competitors' rivalry. So here I think we have to say this is negative. There are so many craft brewers right now that it's increasingly difficult to differentiate. So, one quick way after, again, less than 5 minutes to look at the industry is you can say, doing pretty well. As long as so many don't enter that they compete away the returns, the suppliers and buyers aren't really going to present a huge problem to the industry. Substitutes, very likely that's not going to be a big factor for them. So the real issue in this industry is how do you compete against your peers, right? Not bad for 5 minutes work. And again, great for sparking a conversation with clients. So industry analysis is an excellent start for your strategy work. It makes it crystal clear who the companies are that you're competing against. But as we can see from the chart here, it's pretty clear that that's not the whole answer. If you look across all these different industries, what you'll find here is really true all the time, that the variance in return within a given segment is often much larger than the difference in returns across segments. So understanding what segment you're in really helps, but it doesn't answer the question of, well, within the segment, why do some companies do so well and others do so poorly? To answer that, we need to move on to our competitive analysis. So that then finishes our illustration of the second question. which again is the industry segment creating value? Now let's move on to the third one, which is how does the client's business compare to its competitors? So really important, and what we're going to look at here is something we call bases of competition analysis, which basically asks the question, all right, how are these guys competing against each other? Then we'll look at benchmarking analysis, something called strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, or SWOT analysis. And then Michael Porter also has something to offer here in something he calls value chain analytics. So let me show you what that looks like. So bases of competition is the critical first step in answering this question. You know, companies compete on a whole range of factors, and every company is different and every segment is different. So I really can't give you one exhaustive list of everything that'll work. But the way to think about it is, you know, you're looking for I'll say 5 to 7 key bases of competition. And so the way you can stumble upon these is simply look at the companies you've identified as your competitors and say, well, hold it, this one is winning versus all the others by doing this. This one's winning by doing this one's winning by doing this, etc. And that'll start to sketch out, hey, these are the big bases of competition. So what are some common bases? Almost always there's a scale basis of competition. You have some competitors, an example here is Anheuser-Busch versus Boston Beer. Anheuser-Busch, 10 times or more the volume of Boston Beer. Because they're larger, they're much more efficient in their processes that allows them lower costs. Again, scale is often a very big basis of competition. Also, in almost every segment, you can be big, but if you're wildly inefficient, you're still creating no value. So operating efficiency is always a basis of competition. What's your cost position? Are you solid on your inventory management? Are you vertically integrated? All of those things become important. Marketing is also a real common basis of competition. Interestingly, we've offered an example here of vodka, Absolut versus Smirnoff versus Popov. It turns out that Smirnoff and Popov are actually the same molecules. They come off of the same production line. So the only difference between them is the brand. So brand is super important and marketing is super important when there's very little product differentiation. Because in absence of all that branding, there'd be very little reason to buy one product versus another. So marketing can be really important in some segments. Distribution, over what geography do you distribute? We're going to talk about that when we get to beer, of course, because some are national, some are regional, some are local. What channel? We've got an example here of Domino's Pizza, which is the delivery model, versus Tombstone, which is distributed, again, through grocery stores. And increasingly, we see digital distribution coming up. We've got an insurance example here of eSurance that sells all of their insurance over the web versus State Farm that primarily still sells through agents. Then investment is a common basis of competition in infrastructure and in technology. And then service and relationships are almost always big factors. In service, you've got Singapore Airline where they do everything for you versus JetBlue where they, I'll say, do less for you. And then, as we said, relationships. The key notion behind this program is that we can build relationships by being value-added advisors within banking. That's the exact opposite of commodity sales. It makes no sense to build huge relationships with people if the only reason they're going to do business with you is, well, we're the lowest price. And we can, and it's given that it's a commodity, price is the only real basis for competition. So again, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's a good list to start from in thinking through what are the bases of competition in a given segment. You'll know you have the right factors when you can look at all of them and answer the question, if you're the best at all of these within the segment, are you necessarily the highest value creating company? If the answer to that is yes, you got a pretty good list. You can also, what I like to call the exceptions test, which is where you pull any one of those factors out. And you could say, all right, if you're the best at all of these, but the worst at any one of them, could you be the worst value creating company? Again, if the answer to that is yes, you got a pretty solid list. So we've done that work for craft brewing and come up with the following. What are the bases of competition within craft brewing? No question about it. Scale is really important in terms of barrels produced per year. The geographic coverage. You see this varying all over the place, from very, very small microbreweries to regional to a few that are even working on a national level. So geographic coverage is absolutely a basis of competition in the craft brewing segment. Operating efficiency clearly matters because you can be big, but if you're wildly inefficient, you can still be the lowest value creating company. We also see that product quality is a big differentiator. Some invest much more in the quality of their brews than others. Related to that is breadth of product offerings. Some invest a lot of money in developing a lot of different brews, whereas others have a relatively small breadth of products. Pricing is a key factor, marketing and brand is a key factor, and as we said before, alliance with Goliath brewers can be a really big factor in this segment. So again, across all of them, if you are, quote, the best or better than your peers at all of these things, are you necessarily the highest value creating craft brewery? We look at it and we say, yeah, probably. And if you pull any one of these off, you can say, well, okay, you're the best at all of them, except you don't have geographic coverage. You're the smallest, so you're not creating a lot of value. Or, gee, you have no operating efficiency. So you're big and you got great coverage, but you're earning nothing on it. You get the point. So we've been through those tests. Pretty good initial list. So let's take a look at where Gleason actually stands vis-a-vis its peers on these factors. If we look at volume and growth, it's about average compared to its peers. Its presence is regional as opposed to local or national. Its price per 12-pack is at the very high end of its peers, and its profits, interestingly, are at the very low end of its peers. And of course, it does not have a relationship with the Goliath, as two others of its peers do. As we look at the other competitive dimension, what's their range of products? They have a much deeper product breadth than their competitors. I'm not going to read them all to you here, they're kind of interesting names, but they have many more offerings, both year-round and seasonal, than their competitors. So again, this is just the fact of where they stand today. Also, Gleason has had mixed success with its marketing and brand. On the positive side, it gets fantastic word-of-mouth recommendations from its customers based on its superior taste. And it gets great publicity and numerous awards from brews. Michelle has such a good job in doing all the brewing that she does that, again, she's gotten a lot of awards, and that attracts a lot of natural attention, which is very helpful from a marketing standpoint. However, it only spends about half as much on advertising as its peers do. And the Gleason's brand is not well known outside of the Denver area. And their advertising has been focused more on the overall category, why craft brewing is good, rather than their specific brew, what marketers call secondary demand, right? They focus on primary demand, growth of the entire category, versus secondary demand, why you want to buy Gleason's versus the other craft brews. So it's kind of a mixed bag. There's some good things about their marketing and some not such good things. So as we put it all together, it looks something like this. So again, the question we're trying to answer is, well, what are the bases of competition within this segment, and where does Gleason stand today? And again, let's just start roughly. We can be more quantitative about it if we want, but let's just start roughly and say, well, if Gleason's is better than its peers on a factor, let's put a plus there. And if it's worse than peers, let's put a minus, and if it's about the same, let's put a 0. And so, very quickly, based on the factual analysis that you can do with your client and that we have done here with Gleason, what we can say is, it's about average in terms of scale and geographic coverage. It's not as solid as its peers in terms of operating efficiency, but where it seems to excel right now is in product quality, product breadth, and pricing. But its marketing and brand and its alliance with Goliath are negative. So, let's take this as the fact, right? These are the things you have to be good at, and here's where they stand today. This is a real important setup for the next question, which is, okay, if this is where we are today, what should we do tomorrow? What should we aspire to for our competitive position? And that's question 4. Before we get to that, I want to share with you there's 2 other approaches to getting this type of information. One of them is what's called strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, or SWOT analysis. I want you to see that what we've basically done subsumes this, right? What are the strengths? Well, high product quality, the product breadth, it's a large local brewery, and it's got reasonably good profitability. In terms of its weaknesses, again, all of this follows directly from the work we've already done. So it's simply a different way of organizing what we had on the last page. But still, many people are used to this framework and like to see it, so we've put it here. Michael Porter also looks at a value chain analysis, and this is going to be helpful for us. What it says is, let's look at the 4 basic support activities: infrastructure, resources, technology, and procurement. And then the 5 primary activities of the business: inbound logistics, operations, outbound logistics, the marketing and sales, and service. All of those things together will help us better understand what this company is. And so let's now quickly apply that. And if we put down, okay, here's what's unique about Gleason's. You know, the co-founders are still active, and again, they still have the original CEO and brewmeister. They've got highly trained employees, especially their sales staff. They do a lot of in-house brewing facilities. They use premium ingredients. And again, their inbound operations, outbounds, and marketing and sales and service. We've input the details of the company that will lead you to a more robust understanding of what's unique about them. This is going to be really important because you can then translate that into, when we get to the valuation section, what the impacts of those will be on their value drivers. So we'll pick that up when we get to our last question, valuation. For now, let's move on with question 4, which is, okay, if that's our competitive position today, what strategies might enhance that competitive position over time? And there's several basic options here. There's low cost, there's differentiated, and then there's focused strategies. So let's talk about all of those. Before we get into that, though, I have to make a point here. Competitive strategy is not simply doing better. It's a company's plan for improving its competitive position and value over time. So you could be forgiven for thinking, well, okay, if we're not pluses anywhere in that column, let's just make them all pluses. No, strategy isn't that easy. What you're going to find is certain competitors are always going to outdo you on one dimension or another. So where real strategy lives is in the trade-offs. You know, what typically you find is certain competitors that own certain portions of the bases of competition and let other companies own the others, because it's very hard to own all of them simultaneously. So again, doing better is necessary, but it's insufficient for ensuring a company's competitive position strengthens over time. The basic idea is all of the competitors are also getting better over time. So if you're not getting better faster than the others, you could be getting better, but having your competitive position erode over time. You know, it's easy to fall into the trap of saying, you know, our strategy is to do better. And you hear a lot of companies say things like, we're going to be number one, or our strategy is to, you know, gain market share. Well, as we're going to see, that's not our definition of a strategy, that's a goal. A strategy, as we're defining it, is how you're going to morph your competitive position so that you become stronger over time. And the longer you have an inferior competitive position, the longer value is going to migrate from you to your competitors. In addition, doing better also doesn't inform how you're going to do it. You know, one of my favorite jokes is from Lily Tomlin. She does this routine where she's a bag lady and pushes an old cart around. And at one point she stares at the audience and says, you know, when I was a young girl, I always knew I wanted to be somebody. And now I realize I should have been more specific. And if that's a joke, it's because having a goal is different than having a strategy. A goal, okay, your goal might be to be somebody, but the strategy is how you're actually going to do it, right? So you've got to be more detailed about that. So the key question is, how are we going to improve our competitive position and value over time, which is different than just saying we're going to be better. With that in mind, let's now focus in on kind of key ways of competing that have often been successful for companies. Michael Porter identified 3 generic strategies that create long-term competitive advantage. There's a cost leadership approach, a differentiated approach, and a focused approach. So let's talk about each one of those in a little bit more detail. On the cost leadership side, the thing to think about is structuring each length of the value chain to minimize cost. There's perhaps no better example of this in the United States than Southwest Airlines. If you look at their stock price here, you can see they've created boatloads of value, much more than their competitors over time. And how have they done that? Through minimizing costs by choosing aircraft that are efficient and really good for their generally short-haul flights. They use fewer airplane types that minimizes the number of parts and mechanics that they need to have, which minimizes their repair costs. They procure inexpensive gates and use low-cost hubs, so that also keeps their costs low. They limit in-flight service and snacks and beverages, and also there's no prearranged seatings, which turns out is a much more efficient way of getting seating done. So again, to execute a good low-cost strategy, you look at each segment of your value chain and see what costs you can pull out. On the other side, for high fixed cost industries, scale can be a really important part for implementing low-cost strategies. Again, the larger the number of units over which you're producing, you get to divide your fixed costs over that larger number. So that generates what we call a scale curve. Whereas if you're producing much more than your competitors, your cost per unit is lower, and that can be a lasting competitive advantage. Economies of scale arise from many different reasons. Fixed costs are lower per unit, as we've said before. Some production processes become more efficient with scale, and employees may be involved in more specialized tasks, making them, again, more efficient in what they're doing. However, you want to avoid blindly assuming that just because you're producing more units, you're necessarily more efficient. Beyond a certain point, there can actually be diseconomies of scale. Maybe you need to build a whole nother plant or move to another country or something like that as your scale gets saturated in one given market. Also, in many industries, best practices knowledge is more important than volume in predicting cost per unit. So, you want to think about volume, but also not overdo it. There are often limits to scale economies. Let's now focus on differentiation strategies. Those are completely different. Rather than minimizing costs at every point of the value chain, what differentiation strategies do is they seek to get higher prices, higher profits, and higher value by identifying customers' perception of value and delivering products and services that meet that need better than anybody else. The process here is to identify who the real buyer is, identify what's most important to them, what's first most important, second, third, fourth, etc., and then identify the costs of existing and potential sources of differentiation, and then choose the configuration of features that creates the most valuable differentiation for the buyer relative to the cost of differentiation. And then, of course, reduce the costs in all those activities that are less important in driving differentiation. There's no better example of differentiation than Apple computers. They know more about how customers are likely to use electronics than pretty much anybody, and they have done a fantastic job of not just guessing, but in some cases even defining what the most important criteria are to the customers, so that they've established whole new categories of electronics around a whole new set of needs that has brought all of us in the world much further than perhaps we had thought we could be at this point. So, great example of a differentiation strategy. And you see here again, huge amount of value creation over time from having done that. Focus strategies are particularly important for smaller or private companies. Small companies often lack the ability to dominate their industries on the basis of costs or on high-end differentiation. However, they can still compete effectively using a strategy that's focused on a particular market segment. For many small companies, this means establishing relationships with important customers and meeting their needs better. So leveraging the relationships, gaining superior client knowledge, and providing customized products and services. That's what we're here to do in this case. And also these actions may result in lower costs, increased differentiation, or both. So having now quickly gone through what we've been talking about in a low-cost strategy, in a differentiation strategy, and then with a focus strategy, I also want to make the point there's myriad opportunities other than just those three, and also there's combinations. But those are three good things to think about because they're very common, successful strategies that, again, Michael Porter did a great job in codifying. So let's now move to Gleason. In 2018, Gleason was pursuing a focused differentiation strategy. They were clearly over on the differentiation side with their craft brews and the high quality of those brews. But in terms of their markets, they were somewhere between kind of regional and even getting larger than regional. And so they're kind of somewhere in between on their focus side. So the question then is, what should they do from here? One natural option might be for them to optimize their local strategy. This strategy is most consistent with their current strategy, and if they were to do this, the potential initiatives could be investing in using aluminum cans instead of bottles. Cans are less expensive than bottles, and when the volumes get to be over 80,000 barrels a year or more. But again, remember that they're less than that right now. They're more in the 50,000 barrel range, but still something they might consider as they grow. And also cans protect the flavor of the beer better, which could actually be good to support their differentiation strategy. They could also spend $400,000 in each of the next 2 years to improve their brand and marketing. They could hire a new advertising agency, invest in multimedia campaign, and fix that part of their competitive dimensions. And this approach has a range of advantages and also some issues. On the advantages side, it is close to Gleason's current strategy, and therefore there's relatively low execution risk. But on the issues side, how will customers react to aluminum cans? And will it result in growth? And will more of Gleason's competitors align with Goliath brewers? Those are things we don't yet know. So that's one option for them. If they were to go in that direction, here's what that would mean for their competitive strategy. That would mean, look, in terms of scale and geographic coverage, we're not going to win on that basis, right? There are others that are always going to be larger than us. Of course, at the large scale, outside of our segment, we've got the macro brews, which are, 10 to 100 times larger. So, we're not going to win on that scale. But what we therefore need to do to optimize our local strategy, let's at least make sure that we improve upon our operating efficiency, and using aluminum cans can help us to do that. Let's maintain the advantages we have in product quality, breadth of products, and pricing, but then let's also try to fix our marketing and brand. That's something we can do something about. And then let's leave the alliance with Goliaths alone for this strategy. So again, notice here, strategy is not just do better. It's not look at everything that isn't a plus and make it a plus. It's saying, let's look at the things we might improve at, and let's choose the blend of things that are most consistent with what we uniquely can provide that our competitors would have difficulty in providing. When we do that, we strengthen our competitive position. So this is what one approach could look like, the optimized local. Another strategic option for Gleason would be to align itself with a Goliath brewer. So typically the way that works is equity ownership of 25% or more, where the Goliath gives its cash and its expertise to the business and can offer dramatic growth to the business, as we've seen was done in one of their competitors. And again, in return, what the craft brewer gives is up to 25% ownership of the businesses. So if they were to do that, potential initiatives would be quite different. It would be to commence conversations with relevant Goliaths, see which ones might actually be interested, and then see about leveraging their distribution to access markets throughout Colorado and potentially adjoining states. So this could offer them much faster growth. And then reduce pricing to make Gleason more competitive in those regional brands, and then use their marketing expertise to strengthen the Gleason brand, which again, as we've said, they need. So this strategy also has its advantages and its issues. On the advantages side, the Goliath could provide much broader access to distribution. It could also really provide some marketing wherewithal that they currently lack. But it could also give it some cash to use for the investments for personal and family needs, which, as we've said, are a part of what's operating in the Gleason family. On the issues side, how are their customers going to respond to the alignment? Can they hold on to their benefits of high quality and differentiation as they go through this alliance? Big question. Can Gleason hold on to its high product quality and production capabilities as they ramp up volume? And also, there's probably higher execution risk because this is a little bit more different than what they're currently doing. So, if they were to go that route, notice we end up with a much different configuration of competitive positions. In that situation, we're saying, no, we are actually going to seek to be larger than our competitors and gain geographic coverage. We're going to really improve our operating efficiency, not just by using the aluminum can, which, by the way, the Goliath would already have, but we also want to use their most efficient production processes to really compete on the basis of operating efficiency and win. In terms of product quality, we want to keep that as much as we possibly can. Here, though, importantly, in terms of breadth of products, if we're really going to grow rapidly, it's going to be really expensive to do that with a large number of products. So almost inevitably, to succeed at this strategy, we're going to need to reduce our product breadth. So again, the notion here, you don't want to be pluses everywhere because it's just not internally consistent to do that. In terms of pricing, we could probably reduce our prices a bit because, again, we're going to have our efficiency so much greater that will allow us to lower our prices and increase our sales growth. But then again, what makes all this possible is the alliance with the Goliath. So let's put a plus there. So you see, we've got two very different potential futures for the business. And so how do you decide? That's exactly what the valuation framework can help you and your clients to resolve. So what we want to do here is use the tools of sensitivity analysis, scenario analysis to help make this type of decision using what, as we've said before, not absolute value, but relative value. If you take this strategy versus that strategy, do you end up with more or less value? So what do? On this page, you take the proposed strategy and you work through Michael Porter's value chain. Each link of that chain, firm infrastructure, human resources, technology, procurement, and the inbound operations and outbound logistics, as well as the marketing and sales and service. You look at all of those things and you put down what the impacts would be on the value drivers. What would happen to sales growth? What would happen to profits, fixed and working capital in each of those two strategies? As we said before, there's some specific actions that you would undertake in each one of these strategies. And let's say you've done all that work and come up with the following. If you take the optimized local strategy, sales are going to grow by 7% due to the marketing and branding versus the 5% currently. Operating margins would improve due to the reduction in production costs. But incremental fixed capital would increase for 2 years to fund the aluminum can initiative. And then after that, fixed capital would return to its historical level of 7%. Incremental working capital would stay at its 12% level. If you undertook, though, the Align with Goliath strategy, things would be quite different. Sales growth would be dramatic. It would go up to 10% using the Goliath distribution mechanism. Operating profit would increase significantly due to production savings. An incremental fixed capital expenditure would increase to 12% for 2 years and then return to 7%. And then also the incremental working capital would have to increase to fund the larger inventories that would be necessary for the geographic expansion. So you can see how these different strategies have different impacts on the value drivers. And then you put those value drivers into our valuation model and simply ask the question, okay, today, given our current strategy, it looks like the model gives us a value of on the order of $57.6 million. But if we were to undertake the enhanced local strategy, we see, again, the higher sales growth, the higher margins, and that results in a higher value of $65.5 million. So relative value is definitely positive. We should definitely undertake the local enhanced strategy versus the current strategy. But then let's look at the align with Goliath strategy. You get much higher sales growth, not quite as much, but pretty darn good improvements in margins, and you get it at a lower fixed capital investment incrementally and slightly higher working capital investment. Well, it turns out if you do the shareholder value calculation there, you end up with $68.2 million, showing that the align with Goliath gives you the highest expected value. Of course, this assumes that the cost of capital is the same across these different scenarios and that a Goliath brewer would be interested and a deal could be struck for 25% of the business. We'll talk more about those things later. But given those assumptions, this is what we're looking at. And if we do our sensitivity analysis, what this shows is that Gleason's is much more like, in some sense, a grocery store than it is a jewelry store. It's much more sensitive to changes in profit margins. So again, the good news is both of these strategies have a big impact on profits. Also though, if we remember our specific risk section, we do have to consider here that there's a bit of a shallow end. So the good news is that the align with Goliath strategy does have the highest expected value, but it also has slightly more risk. Right? There's more execution risk because it's more different than what they currently do. And there's issues such as how will customers react to this change? So that's what we've intended to do in this section. We've talked about beer a lot, which is always fun, but the intent is not to get you excited about beer, although by all means, imbibe as you wish, right? But the intent here is to show you that by simply asking a series of 5 questions and doing the analyses to answer those questions, you can map out a reasonable strategy for a company and assess which of the potential strategic options is going to have the greatest shareholder value. So we want you to kind of illustrate this to yourself by now going to our next exercise, which is calculating shareholder value of different strategies for Hammerman Outdoor Media.